All right. So, like Austin said, this is kind of like my trial run for my presentation that I'm presenting at the CSCA Atlantic Conference in 2 weeks now. So, it's coming up. Uh, Basically, what this presentation is like when we get access to force plates, you collect all this data and then you're like, well, what do I do with it now? So, it's kind of like what I've accumulated over the past couple of years and from just like resources that I've taken in from like books, courses, any professional development, and how I actually implement using them. So I guess you could say it's like a presentation I wish I had when I first got access to force plates. Um, okay, cool. So obviously you guys know me, but like Alex at the conference, I'll do like a little intro. But I was a varsity swimmer at Arcadia University. I interned there. Then after graduating, I got the assistant job. Did that for 1 year. Then got the opportunity to go to Cape Breton University, and I've now been there for 3 years. Um, Along that, I was doing my master's online at Rocky Mountain University, and I was majoring in sports performance. Um, it was a good experience because it was nice that I got to work along while getting my master's, but obviously it wasn't necessarily the same experience of actually like going to like a school and like going all in on the master's, but you get just as much experience from working. So um, from there, just a few acknowledgments before I kind of get into it. So Sean Preston was my boss at Acadia. So he's the one who gave me the opportunity to do this as a career path. So he was a mentor of mine, especially early on. Hunter Eisenhower, I've taken a lot of his resources, and a lot of this presentation is based off of some of his stuff. And then Takeoff by Daniel Bove. I don't know if any of you guys have read that, but it really helped make things click for me when I first got Force Play. So I read that book. I think like I read it in like a week, and I'm not really a quick reader. Um, but it helped give me confidence to actually understanding what the stuff was and how to like make decisions from it. And then Force the Biomechanics of Training by Daniel Cleather. It's not a force plate book by all means, but it really breaks down kind of like the physics and the biomechanics of training. And obviously with force plates, it is physics at the end of the day. So it's kind of a tough read at times, but it did help understand kind of like the background of, the base level of physics that you kind of need to understand some of this stuff. So with that being said, there is a brief physics lesson that I'm going to kind of go over. Force itself is kind of hard to describe because like we can't see it. Um, but it's a consequence of an interaction. So force represents an influence that has the potential to change the motion of an object. So we know that if we push something, it will start to move, and then if we push it harder, it'll move faster. So force is just the quality of that push. And then going into Newton's laws, this first one I don't necessarily like refer to a lot in the presentation, but if I'm going to go over the first two, I might as well go over all three. So if a body is at rest or moving at a constant speed in a straight line, it will remain at rest or keep moving in a straight line at a constant speed unless it is acted on upon by a force. So in the context of force plates or like a counter movement jump, basically you jump up in the air and it's the force of gravity that's pulling you back down. And then force equals mass times acceleration. So the acceleration of an object depends directly on the net force acting upon it and inversely on its mass. So I like bringing this up because in S&C, it's kind of tradition to just develop the strength or the force side of the equation. Sometimes people just think just like more mass and we'll get better. Um, but we can also change the acceleration side of the equation by manipulating that, and we can actually expose our athletes like much higher levels of force. And then I think this is probably the most popular law, but the law of action and reaction. So to any action, there's always an opposite and equal reaction. So in other words, the action of two bodies upon each other are always equal and always opposite in direction. So when we push into the ground will push back on us, and this ground reaction force is what actually changes our motion. So in a vertical jump, it is the ground reaction force that propels us into the air. So what I think about is a diving board. So if you were on the end of a diving board and you just kind of like lightly press into it, you'll have like a mini hop into the air. But if you really push down into that diving board or even jump and then bounce off of it, it's going to send you up into the air. So the harder you push into that diving board, the further it's going to send you. And the same goes for the ground, but the diving board just kind of gives you a visual on that. So context and nuance before I actually get into like the weeds of force plate and the CMJ. There are sporting biases. So I primarily work with soccer and basketball. So a lot of like my perspective is from those populations. But like qualities from like a lineman are going to differ from like a point guard in basketball. So I might say that like these certain qualities are good for this. But obviously some sports are different. Like some sports have time constraints, some might not necessarily. So you do always have to consider who is your population. And then from training age, like at the end of the day, if you have somebody with a low training age, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say doesn't necessarily matter. You can just give them very traditional training, and a lot of this will get cleaned up. Um, but then, obviously, once you kind of get past that like GPP or low training age point, then you can kind of get into the weeds with some of your athletes. And then I like the saying of many roads lead to Rome. So this is kind of how I have been using things, but it doesn't mean it's my way or the highway by any means. I'm sure there's other ways that are better than how I do things. But yeah, just want to reiterate that. So starting with data collection, clean data isn't possible without clean collection. So early in my undergrad, I think they told us it was like the three R's of research. Was it reliable, repeatable, and relevant? If you don't check those three boxes, then like, is your data valid? So how we can make sure that we're kind of staying consistent with that is controlling our controllable. So how are we cueing the athletes? Are we giving them feedback? Like, are we going to tell them their numbers or not? Do you allow feedback from teammates? Like, do you let them to talk trash? What is the warm up? Is that consistent? When are you doing the jumps within the session, and how frequently are you doing it? A lot of that is just kind of like you deciding what works best for your situation, but then making sure you kind of stick with that. So this is going to give a visual of kind of what happens with inconsistency. And I couldn't make these videos kind of replay, so I'm going to have to kind of go back and forth. But this first one is all I was thinking was jump high. And then the second one, jump fast. And then finally, I combine the two of jump fast and high. So we can see here that this does change the outcome. So when I thought just jump high, 47.5 centimeters, 786 milliseconds, and then the counter movement depth was minus 40 centimeters. Where when I thought just jump fast, I lost 6 centimeters. Yeah, it was a lot quicker. And then obviously counter movement depth was a lot more shallow. And then when I combined jump fast and high, about the same jump height as jump high, bit quicker, and then that counter movement depth is pretty much the same. So why that's important is sometimes you might just have an athlete come up and you should be like, jump as high as you can, or just like big jump, or whatever language you choose. It's important that you stay consistent with it because the cues that you give the athletes can really affect the data. So I use jump fast and high, and the reason being is most sports do have time constraints. So like if you're going for a rebound, it doesn't matter how high you jump if it takes you like a full second to get off the ground. So it just gives us more context and nuance of like the athlete's like lower body capabilities rather than just like if I were zero constraints whatsoever, like how high can you jump? But obviously sports have constraints and they're chaotic in nature. So jump fast and high, in my opinion, will kind of check more boxes for us of just kind of knowing what they're capable of. So how can we maintain this consistency? So like I just said, just make sure you're using the same cues. What is the physical location of your plates? So I tried bringing the plates to the athletes once. Our track and field team wanted to do some testing, so I brought the force plates out onto the track just to kind of. They were doing a bunch of like track specific testing, but then the coach wanted to do some force plate jumps. I put the plates on the track and like all the numbers, like it wouldn't even read the test because of like that squishy surface underneath the force plates, which like I don't know, didn't really think of in the moment. Like I thought it was a solid enough surface, but obviously that can affect things. So ultimately, like your area and your surface does matter. What arousal level you bring, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but it's like what do you accept? So like, do you let them hype themselves up with music? Do you let them talk trash to each other? Do you do a leaderboard? I think if you like normally do a leaderboard and you normally let them talk trash and then one day you kind of take it away, it can bring down the energy of the testing. Um, how many trials you give them? So I do 3 jumps. I have had times where athletes like will have 3 jumps that they're not happy with. I'm like, oh, can I do a fourth one? And I've let them do it in the past, but I've kind of come to the realization that like if we're just going to let them keep on doing more and more reps, you're just compounding like more data that's like not necessarily like great. And we want their bad reps, especially from a monitoring standpoint. But if if we get them on a bad day and you let them do 6 jumps because they're trying to get a good score, well, that's just going to like skew their averages. So I think you have to like pick a number and then stick with it. When are you doing it within the session itself? So I tried doing like a warm up and then a prep potentiation block, and then I always try to have some sort of vertical component before jumping on the plates, just so the very first vertical jump is not on the plates themselves. Timing during the week. So I do typically game day +2 if our schedules allow it. So for our basketball teams, for example, we'll jump on Tuesdays. They'll normally play Saturday, Sunday. I've chose Tuesdays because Mondays are normally they're coming in kind of sluggish and they don't give me that same intent. So I've just bumped it a day, and I've noticed that I'm just kind of getting better effort from them out of their jumps. And ultimately, like if they're going to come in and like half-ass it, like we're not truly getting what we want out of it. And then frequency. So I do once a week. I know some people do more often, but I think you should do at least once a week because it's like the more data, the better at the end of the day. So this is a graphic from Vald. This like all the phases or the force time curves of your jump. They didn't have the unweighting phase, so I added that in there. And then for now, I'm just going to kind of break down each phase and kind of what I look at just from the force time curves itself and not actually looking at any metrics. So the unweighting phase takes advantage of the free fall and downward acceleration of gravity in order to create momentum to overcome. So we can see on the left, this is an incomplete unweight. So the green is their total force, and then that gray line at the bottom is their zero line. So if the athlete isn't getting at least like 90% of their body weight reduction, then it's not a complete unweigh. On Vology, I don't think you can like highlight that point, but I know with Hawkins you can, where you could like put the like your cursor on that line and it'll tell you exactly kind of where you're at. And then on the right, we can see it's a complete, so where that green line is basically touching the gray. So the unweighting phase is the initial downward movement in the counter jump, where the athlete reduces vertical force to lower their center of mass before transitioning into the jump. So what we're looking at here is, like I mentioned, we're just trying to see if they are completely unweighing or not, and then how are they handling those forces so they can then redirect themselves effectively. Why unweighting is important? Just because like it's not a very popular like quality, I guess you could say, that's like talked about in strength and conditioning or sports performance, but anytime there's a change of direction or a cutting or like going into a deceleration, it does start with an unweighting phase. So the question we want to ask ourselves is there a lack of intent or understanding of the execution of an unweight, or is there a lack of confidence or capacity within the athlete's braking ability? So in order to have this confidence, the athlete must have adequate strength, mobility, stability in the specific areas like the ankle, knee, and hip. And then from there, if the complete unweight isn't present, well, first we can say, well, drop fast, rip yourself towards the ground, staying consistent with that cueing we were talking about. So putting emphasis on the fast part, because the athlete might just think like, oh, the fast just means like exploding up, but it does mean the eccentric and concentric. And then from there, you can assess their performance in the counter movement jump. So did their metrics change? So did their jump height improve or not? Did their RSI improve or not? So if you cue that and their metrics did not get better, if they got worse, it's probably a capacity issue. But if you cue and their metrics improve, then it was an intent issue. So either in the moment, they just kind of like didn't really realize that they should have been dropping quickly. You tell them and it fixes it. Okay, cool, not an issue. Sometimes when you get like like recruits coming in or like first year students, a lot of the times they will come in and not have these like complete unweights. And normally after like a GPP phase, that can get fixed. But something else to consider is like if an athlete has something like jumper's knee, they might have an inhibition to or that willingness to perform the movement with high intent, like have that quick stretch of the tendon. So if they do have a complete unweight and like metrics don't improve, you can ask them stuff like that. Or sometimes you'll kind of get to know the athletes and feel like if they ask them if there's pain present and if they say yes, so like that is also valuable insight. So we don't have to just like look at the plates by themselves. Like you have a conversation with your athletes, and that's honestly going to give you more information than the plates could ever. So how do we train this? Um, we can add eccentric load to have this external cue of the free fall. So it can't be excessive enough where the athlete is tentative to execute a rapid unweight, but something just like 10 to 20 pounds to kind of pull them down can help give that feeling of dropping quickly. And then once the athlete understands this concept, then we can then improve like their physiological and psychological confidence. So I'd always start with just traditional resistance training. Like I mentioned, like if somebody has a low training age, give them like traditional S&C, and honestly, this will probably clean up. And then you can move into like eccentric loading specifically, weighted jumps with emphasis on a rapid eccentric, accentuated eccentric loading to also give you that quick free fall. And then I add deep tier plyos just to build confidence in those deep ranges of motion. So on this vertical jump, you can see that I kind of let the dumbbells like pull me down into the bottom of my eccentric. And then the chain drops. It is a quick eccentric to then into the jump. So the key aspect isn't the exercise, but the intent behind it. If you do like a slow controlled or like a non-counter movement jump, like you're not developing this quality. So it is rapid eccentric. So if there's no intent on free fall, we don't get that unique quality of unweighting. Um, yeah, the dumbbell jump pulled us into the ground with that free fall sensation, and then the chain drop is kind of the same idea, but then you get that almost that potentiation into your concentric phase. Other strategies you can do, like I don't have videos of them, but say if the athletes can't handle the forces to redirect themselves, well, then you could do like light drop catch variation. So kind of like the dumbbell jump, but like they pull themselves to the ground, but then just stick that landing. So moving into the braking phase or the eccentric phase, I tried putting like both terminology of Hawkins and Bald because I'm sure like most people use one or the other. Um, but the unweighting phase generates downward momentum that create or that requires a braking phase to stop, hence the braking phase. And what we're doing here, we're trying to investigate the slope. Um, Jump efficiency is heavily influenced by the braking phase. Forceful braking has higher potential to utilize the stretch shortening cycle to then redirect efficiently with higher forces. So we can see on the left, this is an example of a poor braking phase, an analogy. I'll use a lot of car analogies throughout. So say if you're driving with somebody and they're like stuttering on the brake pedal before a red light or a stop sign, you're going to kind of see those like wiggles in our force time curve. Then an average will be just like a normal stop, like a smooth stop to your stop sign. And then an elite braking is somebody who's going to be ripping and then they pull the e-brake. Um, so a shorter braking phase indicates a higher rate of force development, and that's what we can see in the elite picture. And then so our training should focus on enabling our athletes to slam on the brakes rather than easing off. Effective movers produce force early enough that the propulsive phase becomes a seamless continuation of force production rather than having to restart it. So on the right here, the peak force is early in their braking phase, whereas like on the right, the peak force is kind of bleeding into their propulsion. So they're not getting that quick braking. So then we're not almost not applying that third law of Newton's third law of every action has an opposite equal reaction. We want that hard brake to redirect into our propulsive phase. Um, a more efficient braking phase sets the athletes up to produce more force earlier in the propulsive phase. So the left photo, it kind of signifies that an athlete's almost like getting stuck in the mud at the bottom of their counter movement rather than attacking it hard and then being able to redirect themselves. So our goal is to improve the slope of the braking phase with an overall increase in magnitude. So we want to expose them to high force training to build deceleration capacity. So that starts as traditional strength. We need to build that foundation. So it's traditional strength training and controlled submaximal eccentrics to build that foundation of strength and stability through a full range of motion. That also is going to give us the tendon benefits from slow, heavy resistance training, which will promote our collagen synthesis and will hopefully be helpful for when we get into the faster eccentrics to come in this like later progressions. From there, I progress them into supermax eccentrics. So we know that we're stronger eccentrically than we are concentrically. So if we truly want to stimulate our eccentric capabilities, we need to expose ourselves to loads that our concentric strength can't handle. Um, and then from here on, we're more so manipulating the acceleration side of the equation of force equals mass times acceleration. So drop catch variations where it's a quick drop and slamming on the brakes, or Olympic lifts where you're catching in a high position. So catching without the knees like going past 90 degrees. So it'd be like a power clean variation rather than a full clean. And then depth drops. The reason why depth drops are later into this progression, I know sometimes people will use them and say like a GPP blocks to like get their landings down before going into like their higher level plyo progressions. But for example, like a one rep max back squat can produce say like 3,000 newtons of force. But if you get somebody to jump off like a 40-inch box, I've had athletes go past 10,000 newtons of force on those landings if they land stiffly. So I kind of see it as like a later progression for exposing the high levels of braking force. And this approach enhances their rate of force development, braking rate of force development, their peak braking forces, and it can also help shorten the braking phase, leading to an improved propulsion in sports, which goes with the Newton's third law. And then finishing with like depth drop or drop jump variations. And that's just kind of like putting a more complete movement together of having an eccentric and then a propulsive action afterwards. So variations of this, I like 2-to-1 variations. I don't have weight releasers or anything. So, going down in a split squat, but going back up in a bilateral squat. Um, a single leg depth drop where I'm focusing on a stiff landing, trying not to bleed towards the ground as I land. And then this is a drop catch variation with the trap bar here, where I'm trying to hit the brakes as quickly as possible. So what's important to note with the drop catch and the depth drops is the difference between a compliant and a stiff landing, which I go more over later in the presentation. But like I said, we want to have these stiff landings rather than something where you're kind of like absorbing and melting towards the ground to really get these high ground reaction forces. So I like the cue of stopping on a dime. Um, so we need to ensure for the drop catch variations, you want to make sure that the athlete doesn't have like inhibition or is hesitant to quickly drop. If it becomes more of this slower drop and then this more compliant, like soft, like smooth catch, you're not going to expose them to as high as forces. So honestly, this video is not the best example because you can see as I land, the weights continue to like fall down with me. In a perfect scenario, as soon as my feet hit the ground again, it's like a dead stop. Um, but a easy way to see if it's like too heavy for the athlete is like when they catch themselves, do the plates like bang on the ground? If they do, well, then we know that they weren't able to handle that weight or like those forces, and you just got to get them to go lighter. So because unweighting and braking can kind of like seem like the same, unweighting I think more of like lighter drop catches for the sensation, and then braking is heavier drop catches. So lighter drop catches act as an external cue to pull the athletes towards the ground, where heavy drop catches train the magnitude of higher forces. So moving into the propulsive phase, so on the force time curve, basically, if you were to split that first slope in half, everything to the right would be more so their propulsive phase. So the preceding actions of unweighting and braking heavily influence the propulsive and concentric phase. Training the propulsive aspect of jumping is highly reliant on power development and the ability to produce rapid force vertically. So after the unweighting phase, the athlete is at their lowest point of this counter movement, and then from there they need to produce force vertically to, get up into the air. But especially in the context of team sport, where deceleration and change of direction is huge, we should take care of the unweighting and braking phase first, as that will have more carryover to your propulsive phase, rather than vice versa of like thinking more propulsive, thinking back and carry over to your concentrics. A lot of like traditional lifting is like heavily focused on just like concentric lifting of just bringing the weight down and picking it back up, which obviously like does train the eccentric a little bit. But like I mentioned earlier, like it doesn't like truly like you don't get that same like stimulus on the eccentric phase because it can handle so much more. And then with like Newton's third law, if we can have the handle and produce higher eccentric forces, well, then that is going to translate into the concentric phase. So I think you just like a bit more bang for your buck that way. So the jump height attained depends entirely on the athlete's takeoff velocity, which is influenced by the preceding actions in the jump. But what is their acceleration right before they leave the plates? And that's pretty much how like the formula of the force plates will get your number. But the precise vertical velocity is attained depends on the magnitude of net impulse, so the force generated during the propulsive phase when extending at the ankles, knees, and hips of the jump. So essentially, it's a very intentful, rapid force triple extension. So we're just trying to train rate of force development to increase our velocities at takeoff. So this can be concentric only movements, overcoming isometrics, plyometrics, accommodating resistance, Olympic lifts, and their derivatives. So in like a pin squat, for example, we're killing all of our momentum. So we have to go from like 0 to 100 to get the weight up. Same idea for say an overcoming isometric. There's kind of two ways you can think about it. I'd say like earlier in a season or in a preseason, you can think of them more for building strength, where you can tell the athlete to ramp up. So like say it's a 5 second pull, 0 to 3 seconds you're building, and then for that final 2 seconds, it's as hard as you can. That kind of gives the athlete that like it gives them more time to like learn the positions, and they can kind of like ease into positions that they like. And then later on, you can then train them more for rate of force development, where it's like as soon as you say go, it's as hard as you can, 0 to 100. Um, Plyos, which like will also like train your eccentric strengths as well, but like it's going to enhance your neural drive and increase tendon stiffness for better elastic energy return. Um, Again, don't have videos of this in here, but accommodating resistance just teaches the athletes of accelerating through the entire movement, which just goes with that increasing the takeoff velocity. So making sure that you're producing force to the last second, um, rather than like letting yourself slow down when the weight becomes easier at the top. So I skipped the flight phase because nothing happens. You're just kind of in the air, but then moving into landing. So the process of landing is nothing more than braking from a collision, similar to the braking phase. Um, it is often overlooked by practitioners. And if I'm being honest, I don't take a lot of time on it, except for when I'm in like return to play scenarios. So it is a key component of biomechanical assessment. And you're just trying to see like their basically their asymmetries and like their confidence of landing on one side versus the other. Many change of direction and jumping injuries do occur with the ground. So how an athlete manages these rapid forces are crucial for safer landings and setting up repeat efforts. So I know it's kind of like sometimes talked about in strength and conditioning that like training for safe landings is kind of like, is there really a point because the landings in sport are always going to be chaotic? And I agree with that, but I don't necessarily think of like doing death drops or landings as a way to like make sure that we're like making like safe landings. It's just a way of ensuring that we're exposing them to the high levels of force that they will inevitably reach in their sport. So like, their outputs are going to be highest in a game. So if we can exceed that in the weight room by doing some death drops, um, we just know that when they are exposed to stuff in sport, it's not like it's their first time ever being exposed to that. So like when somebody goes for a dunk, they might be 40 inches in the air. Like they do have to land from that. So, just giving them reps at that hopefully makes them more physically prepared to handle it. So, like I was talking about earlier, what the difference between a stiff and a compliant landing. So, we're just teaching the athletes to manipulate force during landing. So, on the left, it is stiff. I'm trying to stop on a dime. And on the right, I let myself bleed or like absorb force. So, in saying that, I know practitioners will sometimes use the term like absorbing force. And I think that's fine if you're talking to like athletes and like sport coaches because it is a language they'll understand. But I think it is important to reiterate that they're not absorbing it; they're just simply producing that force eccentrically. Um, but these landings expose the athletes to high impact forces as well as rate of forces significantly higher than traditional strength strength training movements. So it can help develop strength and rate of force development in the lower body. From the compliance standpoint, I see it as like more of like a health exercise. So there's value in athletes understanding how to manipulate their forces. Um, because if you think of a sport like basketball, a lot of these athletes are very stiff and they avoid deep ranges of motion. So if we can kind of teach them to handle them and like drop into these deeper range of motions at like a higher velocity, it kind of becomes this more of like yin and yang of training of giving them something that they don't necessarily get within their sport. So yes, we are trying to like develop things that are going to directly affect sport, but then we also need to give them what they're not getting. So I've kind of touched on this, but each phase of the jump influences what comes after it. So your landing is going to be affected by how high you jump. The higher you jump, the harder you're going to land. Your relative propulsive impulse dictates a faster velocity of takeoff. So how much force you put into the plates on your concentric is going to get you off the ground quicker, which dictates your jump height. Um, your early force production and the stress shortening cycle are heavily influenced by your braking phase. And then that's heavily influenced by the ability to generate high forces within the braking phase. And then finally, that braking phase impulse is dictated by the athlete's ability to effectively unweigh. So that's kind of like a lot of words there, but what I'm trying to highlight is like you don't really want to just focus on like one aspect of things. Like you don't want to just focus on the concentric. You want to not just focus on eccentrics. You don't want to just focus on landing. You can pick times of the years like what's going to give you the best ROI. But ultimately, we are training like a complete athlete. So we can focus on like what's going to give us the most bang for our buck, but we do need to train all forms of this simultaneously. Um, so yeah, that's breaking down the force time curves and like how you can interpret them and then make decisions based off of it. And now moving into metrics, what's important to note is like we can't just look at like one metric alone. We do have to look at a few and their relationships with each other. So, for example, if an athlete's RSI increases, well, then we have to ask ourselves why. Like the athlete could be jumping much lower, but choosing a strategy that gets them off the ground much quicker. So they could be doing like that more of like that jump fast cue where they're getting off the plates really quickly and their RSI score looks like it really improved, but then like they lost 10 centimeters on their jump. Like, is that good? Um, Jump height can go up, but the athlete changed their strategy where their time to take off and RSI drop, or their time to take off isn't changing at all, but their counter movement depth increased within the same time. So they're going through more range of motion in the same amount of time. So that typically means they are increasing their braking metrics. So that is a favorable adaptation. So you need to ask yourself, like in the context of your sport, are these changes favorable? You can't just like always just look at jump height and think, okay, this is getting like jump height's up, it's good. But if it took them an extra 400 milliseconds to get up, like is that necessarily good for sport? So these are all the metrics that like I take a look at, and that was one of the things when I first got force plates that was like very overwhelming. It was like there's like hundreds. You don't really know where to start with it. Um, so obviously there's jump height, which you can think of is the engine. So it represents the system's overall output. Larger engines facilitate faster speeds. So just how athletes achieve jump heights through impulse and takeoff velocity. Two cars or athletes can have different methods. So one can have a raw force output, or one is like more efficient. But our jump height tells us what happened, but not how it happened. Then time to take off or the contraction time. So this is the total time from the initiation of your movement to take off. So you can think of this as a strategy and output metric. Um, this gives you additional insight when you look at it with counter movement depth as well. So you can think of this as the transmission of your car. It refers to how effectively energy is transferred from the lower body to the vertical movement. And efficiency in force transfer is crucial. Shorter isn't always better, so rushing can lead to inefficiency. So if you have somebody who isn't great at like those fast twitch like jumps, their numbers aren't necessarily going to be great. But then if you have like a more twitchy athlete who doesn't need to go through a lot of range of motion, who doesn't need a longer contraction time, that could be favorable for them. Mean reactive strength index, so it's your jump height divided by your time to take off. So this is how quickly an athlete can access their jump capability. So I see this as like an efficiency metric. how efficient are they in this jump strategy. So this is like the throttle. It can control the speed and power. So a sharp throttle response leads to immediate acceleration. So fast force production in athletes results in quick takeoff and efficient performance. And then counter movement depth. So how deep the athlete squats before starting the concentric phase of the counter movement jump. So this is mostly a strategy metric, but then I also think of it as a monitoring. From a monitoring standpoint, you can look at it like if somebody's range of motion is increasing, you can ask them like if they're fatigued, because if they're tired, athletes are gonna try to self-organize to always get the best outcome. So they might self-consciously start like squatting lower in hopes of getting a better jump. Um, so if you see that like an athlete's counter movement depth is increasing out of kind of nowheres, you can ask them like what's going on in terms of like a fatigue standpoint, and you'll probably notice that in like other metrics as well. Um, but it can give us an understanding of the tissues the athlete prefers to leverage, and you can think of that as the suspension of a car. So it absorbs impact and then it redirects their energy for upward propulsion. Um, And then moving into their peak relative braking forces. So this is your instantaneous vertical ground reaction force applied during the braking phase. This gives us an understanding of their absolute capacity of their braking ability. So obviously that's going to be like the brakes of the car. So in a car, stronger brakes improve cornering by enhancing momentum control. So in a counter movement jump, higher braking force supports aggressive drops and then quick propulsive transitions. Weak brakes cause inefficient speed handling and then slower reversal. So it'll give you like a less efficient ability to transfer from your eccentric to your concentric phase. Your braking phase is just the duration of that phase. And it gives us an understanding to the strategy associated, but it's most helpful when paired with time to take off and counter movement depth. So it's how efficiently that capacity is applied, and you can think of that as the brake pad. So it absorbs their energy, it controls momentum, it can aid in reversal. Efficient athletes have brief braking phases with minimal energy loss for smooth transitions, but poor braking phases lead to delayed responses, poor control, and energy wastage. So if your braking pads are shot, like you're not really going to trust that car as much to slam on the brakes. And then your peak relative propulsive power. So it's your instantaneous vertical ground reaction force applied during the propulsive phase. It's our main propulsive metric. It gives an understanding to the absolute capacity of the propulsive ability of the athlete. So how aggressively and effectively the athlete accelerates upwards, which is their gas pedal. So it reflects the forcefulness of an athlete's movement, combining force and speed. And it's high powered athletes can achieve explosive acceleration and reach peak takeoff velocities faster. And then this is a new one for me, that's a little bit more nuanced, but it's the P1, P2 propulsive impulse index. It's the ratio of the propulsive impulse applied during the first and second half of their propulsive phase. So kind of if they're going through the concentric phase, P1 is that first half, and then P2 is that last half before they actually take off. And it gives us an understanding to how and when the athlete produces their force. Is it early or late? And you can think of that as like their horsepower. So it measures an engine's ability to provide power during acceleration. Efficient athletes produce force early and maintain acceleration through takeoff. So what's important there is the maintaining acceleration. So thinking of like accommodating resistance movements, can the athlete continue to accelerate up until the last second before they leave the ground? So poor P1, P2 ratios lead to delayed acceleration and inefficient speed buildup. The horsepower signifies the effectiveness of sustaining and delivering power throughout the entire movement. So what I do is after we jump, I just kind of like take a look at the metrics. So Vault kind of cleans them up on like a table like this. And then depending on where we're at in the year, are the numbers trending in the direction that we'd like? Yeah, depending on where we're at. So if we're in a phase of the year, so for example, if I take basketball, um, after like once we're in say November, I'm going to start focusing on a lot of like eccentric training or braking training. So we should see peak forces in their eccentrics increase. And if they're not, well, then why? Same goes for like basically any of the metrics. So if we want them to be getting like faster contraction times and we're not noticing that, then we need to kind of like audit our programs and ask ourselves why that is happening. So I don't spend like, it's just a quick glance. So we can see on like the difference column, you can just see if it's above or below their average from their latest test date, and it's just a way to quickly check in to see, okay, are we moving the needle in the direction that we want to be? And then from a monitoring standpoint, I pay attention again to the athletes' averages and if they're dropping acutely. So, say an athlete is down 10% in a few metrics compared to last week. Well, there might be value. Well, there's always value, but of having a conversation with the athlete of asking, what's up. And typically, if an athlete is going to tell you they're tired and the numbers say they're tired, they're probably tired. Um, but it can go the other way too, where like an athlete can come and tell you that they're tired, and like, oh, like, I don't really want to lift today, and they jump and hit a PR. So it goes both ways. Um, but if you're seeing significant drops in a few metrics, there could be value of maybe having a conversation with a sport coach, just letting them know where the team or a player is at. But then also like how can you change your program to make sure that like maybe you need to optimize recovery for them. So examples would be like back to back where an athlete plays like 290s, long travel, and it's like mid to late season. Like we can kind of sometimes predict this stuff to happen, and it's good to just have these numbers to back it up. Especially, sometimes you have these like old head coaches that just want to like push through everything. It's good to kind of have this to be like, we are breaking down a little bit. But I think it's important that like we should try to change stuff on our end um, before necessarily thinking that it's like the sport coach's fault and like practice plans. Like, what can we change within our program to like kind of hopefully like get over the hump? So now I'm going to be going into more of like the archetypes and like the styles of jumpers. So there's three types of curves. So unimodal, which is this single hump, bimodal secondary, where the peak is second, and then bimodal primary, where the peak is first. So by recognizing the number of peaks and how they're sequenced, we can begin to describe athletes' strategy and efficiency. And then this gives us a decent understanding of what type of training interventions might be necessary for the athletes. So typically, a unimodal jumper is pretty efficient and they use stored energy well. The jump heights are okay. Like they're not always the highest jumpers, but they're normally not your worst. Um, very shallow kind of movement depth. Their braking phase duration is short. They have increased in eccentric capacity and magnitude. Their propulsive forces are high and they have fast propulsive phases. They're great at braking and using stored energy for propulsion. So these athletes are typically more elastically driven um, when we see these force time curves. And then bimodal secondary. So this is often seen in lower, taller, longer athletes, or maybe like undertrained athletes that's normally are lower jump heights, decreased braking qualities, poor stretch shortening cycle utilization, and they solely rely on the propulsive qualities. So you can kind of see that how like all the higher forces are on the second half of the curve. So I've found this to be kind of the least desirable. And then sometimes these athletes specifically have like an inhibition to flex at the knee. So they might not actually like possess like the structures for this, but they might just be say like injured or they have an injury history that is causing this force time curve. So like, well, if we can get them pain free, they might move away from this. So why a double peak can occur, there's a few reasons. So as an athlete moves towards 90 degrees of knee flexion, you're at a more disadvantageous position for producing force. So this may cause a lapse in force production after hitting the bottom of the counter movement. So it's kind of like getting stuck in the hole. So if you have poor mobility or stability, and that's paired with this disadvantageous position, it can give you these more like unique force time curves. And sometimes when you have like really tall players, when they drop, their trunks will fall forward. So that continuation of momentum will create that second peak. And then bimodal primary. So of the two bimodal curves, I see this one as more desirable. We have good jump heights, contraction times are low, rate of force development, power outputs are up, and their braking qualities are normally pretty good. They don't have the same ability to harness potential energy like the unimodal curve, um, but it's definitely better than the bimodal secondary. And then ICGs is like hybrid athletes, so they have a mix of like muscular and elastic driven qualities. So this was a study that came out and it looked at NBA players and it characterized their downward eccentric phases. Um, so it looked at their strategy for their counter movement jump and it broke them into three categories of stiff, hyper, and hip flexors. So taking a look at it, I tried mimicking these jumps. So this is what I would consider like a stiff flexor. We can see short contraction time underneath 600 milliseconds. It's kind of a unimodal jump. And yeah, the jump height wasn't great on that day, but that's where it was on that day. Uh, Hip flexors, so a lot of range of motion at the hip, but not a lot at the knee and ankles. So they use a lot of posterior chain. There's not a great ability to unweigh, as you can see in the force time curve. And then our rate and output metrics do drop. So we can see that, especially like eccentric peak force is only 19 compared to 29 and 28. And then hyperflexor, so it's kind of like that mix of both. So it's a deeper flexion of all joints, so it's a more full range of motion. It has a slight decrease in rate dependent metrics compared to the stiff flexor. Um, but typically the power outputs are pretty good. So this is good for, say, individuals that have like controlled jump. So it's like an open rebound or like you can predict the header coming in. So if you have that time to like really create your force, this is a good strategy. It can become unimodal if you have really elite braking and propulsive abilities. So unimodal curves typically look like stiff flexors, and they rely more on elastic or tendons. Bimodal primary is more a hyperflexor, so it's kind of more muscular or hybrid. And then bimodal secondary is a hip flexor, which are typically more like underdeveloped, or you're just like really tall, lanky athletes. So when I mentioned like elastic and muscular dominant, like I acknowledge like the tendons and the muscles never act in isolation, but we can see like in essentially they're like counter movement deaths, and their force time curves and their jump strategies. We can make assumptions on which tissues they do prefer to leverage. So athletes will self-organize strategies that work best for them and their structures. So, oh, that middle picture is not loading for you guys, is it? No, it's LeBron. Um, but so the same jump height can be achieved with different strategies. Players will self-select what works for them. I think as coaches, we should train athletes based on their natural tendencies and not force a single strategy. So what can we clean up within their given strategies? And then can their training kind of be tailored to their strategy to optimize performance? So you see like an elastic athlete is going to be somebody like John Morant, super twitchy from a structural standpoint. They're going to be narrow ISA, more like ectomorph. They probably have like very long tendons, short muscle bellies. And then on the other side of the spectrum is like Nikola Jokic, so more of a muscular, wide guy. You can obviously tell that like these two athletes probably produce force in different ways. And the middle is supposed to be LeBron, or say like Jason Tatum, or maybe even like Zion Williamson, where it's these people who kind of like are a mix of both. Like they can express force very rapidly, but they do still have like that muscle mass on them. So training around jump strategies, like what are the typical weaknesses of a given like force time curve or strategy? So like a muscular athlete can have like longer braking phases. So like how can we enhance their ability to say free fall and brake hard in the off season? So we don't want to like change their strategy. So like how can we clean it up? So like if we were to look back at some of the force time curves where they wasn't a complete unway and it was kind of like squiggly lines, like they might stay bimodal secondary just because of their structure, but can we make that force time, can we make that slope a little bit steeper? Can we get rid of some of the asymmetries? Can we make it a more smooth transition? um, Obviously you want to understand the time of the year and then also the training age. So like just because an athlete comes in and say they're like a bimodal secondary jumper, you're not just going to like reinvent your periodization and be like, oh, we have to like completely change the program. Like I think you still like you stick to the plan. Um, and then like just like anything, you can kind of focus on strengths in season, weaknesses in the off season. Same can go for like if you have unimodal or more elastic driven athletes, sometimes from my experience, especially with like basketball players, these athletes typically don't really respond well to like heavy bilateral training. They get really sore. They're honestly not very good at it. And it doesn't look great. And if it doesn't look great, it's probably not great for them. So instead of trying to like forcing them into it, like how can we change things for them uh, to make like a more smooth, like a smooth program for them. So they sometimes respond better to more unilateral variations and more velocity based movements. Whereas the other side, your muscular based athletes are typically, your better lifters. They like heavy bilateral lifting. However, like I've mentioned before, they do lack that ability to utilize free energy. So we can give them what they're good at, but keeping in mind what their weaknesses are. Those are just like a few points. You can go into the weeds of like how you can differentiate like training for ISA angles, but there isn't really the time for that in this presentation. So last slide. So from here, I stole this quadrant from Hunter Eisenhower and then just like applied it with my guys. So quadrant one, he uh, called them cannons. So this is your muscular developed athletes. Two is your whips, your elastic developed. Three is your rubber band, elastic underdeveloped. And four is your muscular underdeveloped. So on the bottom is their counter movement depth. And then on the y-axis is their jump height. So essentially, based on the athlete's structures or jump strategies, are they on the right side of the quadrant? So somebody who is more muscular driven or wide ISA, we want them to be more so on the right, and then vice versa. Somebody's more narrow or tendon driven is going to be on the left. So we can begin to ask questions. So is the athlete on their optimal side based off of structure, based off of injury history? Like, are they avoiding flexion or loading specific tissues? We can look at the force time curves and their jump strategies. And then from there, we can go even deeper. So do we want to shift them horizontally or do we want to shift them vertically? So if we have that wide muscular athlete on the left, well, our goal should be to shift them right and vice versa. First would be focusing, if they're on the top, you want to focus on keeping them healthy and then maintaining and improving their qualities to keep their outputs and keep their same strategies. And then if athletes are on the bottom, well, then our goal is to then bring them to the top of the quadrant and optimizing their strategies. From a logistics standpoint, like you're not just going to like make 15 programs for 15 different guys based off the quadrants they're in, but you can use this to like find who the outliers are. So for example, on like the top right of the muscular developed was one of my guys who structurally is narrow ISA, super long tendons, like barely any muscle on him, very short muscle bellies. So like I would look at him as an elastic developed athlete, especially as the way he plays basketball. But he shifted towards muscular developed because he started going through a much larger range of motion and was still getting good jump heights. And he was actually dealing with turf toe. So he wasn't having like as much comfort of like dropping into his eccentrics quickly and like really pushing off the ground hard. So he like changed his jump strategy because of like a toe. Um, so our goal with him is to this year, especially to try to shift him back to the left side. Because based off his structure, that's probably where he should be. Um, so yeah, is there a structural whip in the cannon quadrant or vice versa? How can we help them gain access to their superpowers? And typically, it is a health or pain issue that will put an athlete in their wrong quadrant. So, in summary, tech is just a tool. Don't lose your coaching eye. So sometimes I'll see even like interns, like, and I've caught myself doing this, like you'll cue them to jump and then you're just like staring at the iPad the whole time. And not actually looking at how the athlete is jumping. So the numbers aren't going anywheres. They get saved to the cloud. So watch the athlete jump, then you can look at the numbers. It's also a great opportunity to talk to your athletes one on one. So, seeing how they're feeling, um, ask them like how practice was, how their bodies are feeling. It's a good like touching point with them. But yeah, like watch the athlete and then look at the numbers. Um, Training is a manipulation of force. So just kind of reiterating the force equals mass times acceleration equation. I think from a physical preparation standpoint, most sports have time constraints. A lot of sports are done at higher velocity. So how can we expose them to these higher, faster forces within the weight room? That doesn't mean we don't do the traditional stuff. Like we definitely do, but I think there's like from a physical preparation standpoint, we can do it more than just um, you know, push, pull, legs. Um, it is more than just jump height. I mentioned this earlier. So jump height tells you what happened, but not how. I think jump height itself is kind of an overrated metric. Like it's the metric that we all understand and we all want to see improve. But from a standpoint of actually trying to make decisions from this data, it doesn't give us a whole lot. So yeah, it doesn't bring much insight and influence on decision making. So we do have to kind of open the hood and see what else is there by looking at other metrics. And then context matters more than the isolated numbers. So I bring up like the biopsychosocial model. So we can't just only look at these athletes' numbers. We have to consider them as a whole. So like get athletes' feedback. And if an athlete enjoys the program, they'll be more bought in. Thus, they'll bring more intent. So the higher intent will give us better results. Yeah, that's it.
Sweet, that's awesome, man. I think you're in a good spot. I don't have any questions off the top of my head. If anyone else has any, feel free to jump in.
No, I mean it was very in depth. Every every time a question popped up for me, it was answered like next slide very
Sweet.
thoroughly. So,
That's good.
so
Do all you guys use force plates? You don't, Austin? Yeah.
No.
Morgan, do you have at your clinic? I know you have some vault stuff.
yeah, I have some vault stuff. I don't have the force plates, but I mean
Oh,
Ozzy and
okay.
I both used force plates for a handful of years at UMB. Like
Right.
I'm familiar with a lot of the metrics and what we're using them for, but I haven't had
Hmm.
any practice with them in the last couple of
Yeah.
years. No.
Yeah. Something that I originally I thought I was going to put in and then, got into the weeds of making the presentation, but putting a slide on like if you don't have plates and just kind of like going back to like looking at the athlete's strategies. So like seeing like doing any sort of like vertical jump assessment and then you can assess like are they stiff hyper or hip flexors and like you can kind of like make some assumptions from there just because obviously not everybody has force plates because they're really expensive but there are ways to kind of make decisions just by using your coach's eye.
Yeah, I'll loosely use like a jump mat and eccentric utilization ratio to do
Yeah.
kind of the same quadrant that Hunter Eisenhower kind of came up with there because
Hmm.
you can kind of tell again loosely like are they kind of more stress shortening cycle driven, are they
Yeah.
more muscular driven, so you can at least kind of get them on the x-axis a little bit, and then obviously
Hmm.
you get some jump heights. It's not as fine tuned because you can't dig into like the whys behind the RSIs and the braking and stuff like that, but it does give you a general overview of like, hey, they might be a bit more elastically driven.
Hmm.
Which I mean, any insight is good insight. Obviously, it's more helpful to have all
Yeah.
the metrics if you can have them, but
For sure. I know even Josh Bray has said some stuff where like he'll take in the athletes like psychology, so like how they perceive the weight room and their relationship with it. Like typically you're more like elastic driven athletes are normally the ones that like don't like the gym and vice versa. Like if they're muscular driven, they like getting after it in the gym. Obviously that's not like a perfect science, but like I do see correlation with that for sure.
I really liked, so as someone who uses force plates, um, and have been kind of slowly diving more and more into it. Two of the things you mentioned that I really liked, um, thinking back to like when I was newer with force plates, was the different peaks, like the unimodal, bimodal, primary, and bimodal secondary. Like I just started diving into that within the last probably 2 years because it was before it was all about the metrics. Because of course they show you so many different metrics and you kind of get lost in it when a lot of the stuff now I'm learning is taking a step away from the actual data and like looking at the athlete when they jump, or looking at, yeah, like what does the peaks and those kind of things look like, because you can get a lot of good data from that. And the other thing that was really helpful for me within this presentation is the difference between Vald and Hawken language. Like, so we have
Yeah.
Hawken, and so everything is like, breaking phase, breaking this, but everything you read online is like in the eccentric this, in
Yeah.
the what, and I'm looking online, I'm like, what, like, and in my head, like once you put two and two together, it's like, oh, that makes sense. But I'm like, why can't we just use the same words? Like, why are different companies using different things? So actually, as you laid that out, I love that you explained the difference. I thought that was super helpful.
Yeah, I found that very confusing as well. And I definitely like as I was making this presentation, I was like, it was pretty easy to kind of Google it. I literally just said like, what is Vald's version of this metric? And it told me, and then I just double checked it on Vald myself because I use Vald. And I used Hawkins when I was at Acadia, but I definitely was not into the weeds as much back then. Um, I like, I don't know, like I like breaking phase better than eccentric phase. I don't know why. Like I think that makes more sense to athletes to say the breaking phase. But like at the end of the day, like you said, like they all kind of mean the same thing. And then once you do put them side by side, you're like, oh yeah, that does make sense. Um, and I did the same thing when I first got them. Like I was just looking at all the metrics, and I like felt like I was changing the metrics that I was like looking at every month, because I'd like find a new piece of literature, like talk to the representatives that involved, and like they'd present this metric to me, and I'd be like, okay, so like that's the one I need to be looking at. Like that's the missing piece. And that's like I was changing it so often that I wasn't even like measuring anything. I was just like looking at different numbers all the time. And then I was in the same boat. Like I think it was Hunter Eisenhower. He posted on Instagram saying like, if you could only have one, would it be force time curves or metrics? And I commented, I was like, oh, it'd be metrics because I have a bunch of athletes, so I don't have the time to look at like 100 different metrics. And he was like, well, yeah, but now you're looking at 100 different like five metrics for 100 different athletes versus just 100 force time curves. I was like, oh yeah, you got me there. And the force time curves are like, you can run the jump and you can look at what happens, and you can kind of keep those mental notes. So it has definitely helped like kind of put it all together, because the metrics, there's just so many that's like you're just paralysis by analysis.
Yeah, I was the same way when I first started. Like pretty much every semester, I would be tracking something different. And what I've
Mm.
realized is everybody has, like, actually, another newsletter I subscribe to, based on whatever our conversation a couple months ago, is Matt Jordan does one. So every now and then, it's usually something about ACLs or force plate stuff. And just this past week, it was like the 9 metrics you should track in ACL return to play. And so, of course, I write those down and I'm kind of looking into them. And not that they're not valuable, but I think the value in force plates and in any metric, as we know, is like just pick one and track it. Like, even if it's
Mhm.
wrong, you're better off tracking, maybe an incorrect metric, or not incorrect, but like the not best metric over a long period of time, rather than switching all the time, because otherwise you're not getting good data. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and a lot of the metrics overlap, and then there's some that have like high like fluctuations. Like I know rate of force development can have like thousands of newtons a difference between like two reps. And then it's like, well, how do you actually like take that? Um, so like I know some people say like from like a testing day, they'll like taking rate of force development from like, but from like an assessment standpoint or monitoring is like not a good metric. And then I spoke to one of the guys at Vald, and he said that like they like to use takeoff velocity because it's a very consistent metric. Like it's always within like, you know, 0.076 and 74. So like, like you can always kind of look at those numbers because they're very consistent. Like, I don't know, like there's so many that you can look at, but at the end of the day, I think you just have to stay consistent with it. And to be honest, like I'll probably end up changing some of the ones I look at next year, but I'm gonna try not to as best as I can.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it there a little bit, but I'm curious as to your processes then for kind of looking at your data and being able to decipher that, because I know that's kind of where I'm stuck right now is like, okay, yeah, I understand that the forced time curves are pretty important, but yeah, if I have 100 kids jump in a day, when am I finding time to go look at all of those forced time curves, right? So I'm just curious on what your process is for actually kind of breaking down all that data that you're taking in.
Yeah, so that's where the quadrant is handy. Um, and that was very popular with Hawkins, and Vald only added it like a couple months ago. So that was huge when they added it. So basically, the quadrants are easier to check in on, and you can kind of like throughout the year just see like are the athletes shifting into the positions that you want to, and like that's pretty easy to check in on if you have them like split up by team. Same with it's not very often that I'll sit down and like look at every single force time curve. That is more of like in the moment I pay attention to it, and a lot of the time it checks out with like if you watch them play their sports, if you look at their structures, like they do tie in very closely. So you can kind of make those mental notes. And like, I'm not saying I memorize it, but it's like, oh, I know like Aaron is like super tendon driven. So like he's most likely unimodal. And like, so like I kind of like, if I'm making an Excel sheet where I'm trying to like clean it up, I'll like put them in. And then there's kind of like the few people that I'm like unsure about. And then like I'll check in and like I'll look at maybe a few of their jumps. And like, I don't do that every week by any means, but um yeah, it's a lot of mental notes and like trying to go based off like how well I know my athletes. Um but the quadrant is definitely like the easiest way to kind of just like take a quick look at it and see like are we shifting where we want them to. If that
Okay, yeah,
answers your question.
yeah, absolutely. It makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, I'll have to kind of dive into those quadrants a little bit more. And probably, do you have like,
Yeah.
do you have a couple different ones set up that you can kind of just look at the different metrics, or are you just kind of mostly basing it off of that one that you showed there?
That's the only one I used because I only started using that like halfway through this season. So this coming season is going to be my first full year of using it. So I'm going to keep it simple. I think that's something I didn't really mention, but like if you try to do too much, you're you're not going to do anything because it is a lot to, especially if you are somebody who has like 100 athletes and you don't have like office hours. Like I don't have office hours. Like I'll coach like 12 hours straight some days. So yeah, like and I lost my train of thought. Um, wow, I'm really drawing a blank right now. What was your question?
I was just asking about how many different quadrants you have set up.
Right, yeah. Yeah, no, I just do that one because if I do too many, then like some of them are just gonna like not get looked at. And I think like Cole mentioned it, like you're better off just like picking one thing and staying consistent with it, by like trying to do too many.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And
I've
then,
seen some people, you can't do this with Involved itself, but they like took their numbers, they put it in the chat GPT, and they made their circles expand based off their like time to takeoffs or their contraction times to like give added nuance to the same quadrant. I haven't done that personally, but like I have seen some people do that.
okay. And then one last question is kind of unrelated to everything. In terms of like clipping this up and kind of getting it posted online, do you want us to wait until after your presentation in a couple of weeks before kind of start rolling this out, or are you not pressed about that?
I think you guys can just post it. Like if you get that, probably doesn't really
I think you
matter.
should. I think you should post it because then you can be like,
Yeah.
hey, like come see me, present this live kind of thing.
Yeah.
Little teaser.
Mhm.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll do that.
Sweet.
Go for it.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I don't have anyone lined up for the next couple times here, but we'll work on getting people lined up and getting more good presentations. Thanks, Aubrey. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for letting me do that. It definitely get some of the rust off and hopefully make me a little less nervous for when I actually go to do it.
Yeah. No, that was awesome. You'll kill it, man.
Yeah.
Super insightful.
Yeah.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sweet.
Thanks, guys.
Enjoy your Sundays, fellas.
Yeah.
See
Have a
you
good
guys.
one.
All right. See ya.